Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean and I'm terrible at making lists, but today I want to talk about the top 15 books that I read in 2022. I know, top 15, up from last year's 12, which was already up from most normal people's 10. Oh well, timestamps down below. In 2022, I read pretty close to 100 books, I think. I don't count books that I read for work, and so I don't have an exact number, but I had a pretty good reading year, I think, and I read a lot of really long books that took a lot of time and energy, which I think was good. And to make up for doing a top 15 list rather than a top 10 list, I have put these in a rough descending order from 15 to 1. This is a really rough order. On another day, I could have moved these around 1 or 2 positions pretty easily. I don't really like ranking books, I don't do star ratings, and my tastes are admittedly a bit flippant day to day, so keep all of that in mind as I go through these. And at the very end, I do have a handful of honorable mentions that I think just warrant another mention on this channel. And lastly, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible here. Most of the books that I really wanted to talk about, I've already done a review of, or I have a review in the works, so let's just jump into it. Number 15 is The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. This book does some things very well and other things not so well. It's a nearly 1,000-page fictional autobiography or memoir of a certain SS officer named Maximilian Aue, and it's really about kind of how he was able to do the things that he did and continue to live with himself. And there are tons of problems with this book that I've spoken about previously in my review and one of my reading wrap-ups. I go a little bit more in depth with some of my problems here. But the amount of research that went into this book is incredibly admirable. And I think just that alone makes it deserve a spot on the list. But the reason why it's really here is because the things that it did do well, these massive set pieces, the description of the Battle of Stalingrad, and the description of the Eastern Front in general, I think is done just so magnificently. And there are parts of this book that have stayed with me throughout the year ever since I read it. And I think like the first 30 pages alone make this book worth the price of admission. It brings up all of these really interesting questions about what do we do with individuals or groups who did terrible things? And especially as so many of us who are reading this live in countries whose government does terrible things. So it really brings up a lot of really fascinating questions. Though again, I do have quite a few problems with this, from its structure to its characterization of Maximilian Aue to its prose. But there are so many parts of this book that are so deeply affecting that it certainly deserves a spot on this list. Number 14 is Osebol, Voices from a Swedish Village by Marit Kapla. This is a book that I just love the idea behind this book. What it sets out to do is capture the oral history of a small, rural, and dying town in the middle of Sweden. The author, Marit Kapla, went to this town of Osebol and interviewed all of its citizens, about 40 people, and she took down their stories and their words. And what she does in this book is simply take their stories and their words and put them into a free verse. But she retains the natural cadence of these storytellers so effectively. And so this book is so quiet and reflective as, again, we get all of these different voices, and so many of them are quite old. So many of them have died since she recorded their words only a couple of years ago. But each of their individual voices shine through. And I just enjoyed it so much because it captures oral storytelling at its very best. Each of the speakers are just such good oral storytellers, and it's really in the simplicity and the mundanity and the ordinariness of their stories that they tell that I just found to be so moving. The next on my list is Salka Valka by the Icelander Halldór Laxness. Now, Halldór Laxness is already one of my favorite authors of all time, as you can tell by my basically whole shelf full of Laxness. And Salka Valka, in this brand new translation that came out earlier in 2022 by Philip Roughton, makes Salka Valka one of my top 2 Laxness books, up there alongside Independent People. And I really just found the character of Salka Valka to be so enchanting, so captivating. She's such a great character to view Iceland as it emerges into a independent country, into a nation in the early 20th century. What this book follows, or what this book does, is follow Salka, this young, kind of destitute woman, as she grows up into a fiery and independent woman. But it's through her that we see all of these debates, these economic, cultural, political, sociological debates concerning Iceland's future as they are striving to get out of the colonial thumb of Denmark. So like independent people, much of this book is about how Iceland becomes independent, how they became their own independent country. And so a majority of this book is really Laxness working through all of these different ideologies, from capitalism to Marxism. And so parts of this book were absolutely a slog, but Salka Valka is just such an amazing character, and Laxness is, at the sentence level, such a brilliant writer that this book absolutely deserves its spot on my list, and it's one of my favorites by Laxness. Number 12 is Poguemahone by Patrick McCabe. This is a 600-page novel in verse that has a voice that is just so compelling, and it's so unique. Like Osebol by Marit Kapla, it's written in free verse, but McCabe has such a command over language that he creates in his free verse just an incredibly addictive rhythm. Poguemahone follows a brother and a sister who moved to London in the early 1970s from Ireland. But the story is told more or less in the present by the brother, Dan Fogarty. And he's mainly talking about his relationship with his sister, Una, who in the present has Alzheimer's, and she's in an assisted living facility. And so this book is really about memory, personal memory, cultural memory, national memory. There's a lot of kind of Irish-English relations in here, but it's also very much about the personal memory of someone with Alzheimer's losing their memory. But it's also about immigration, the punk scene in London in the 1970s. And yeah, it's really just a very compelling and good book. It's one of the best books on Alzheimer's that I've read, I think. And like I know I've said it in my review, but I strongly recommend the audiobook version of this that Patrick McCabe himself narrates. He adds such life to this book that I'm not sure if I would have found Poguemahone's rhythm by myself without him reading it aloud to me. But it's a great book either way. Number 11 on my list is the Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. This is easily among the best fantasy books that I've ever read. It's right up there, right up next to Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The atmosphere that this book creates is so palpable, and the prose is actually good, unlike most fantasy books. It reads more like a Jane Austen novel or a Charles Dickens or an Alexander Dumas novel rather than a traditional fantasy book. But so alongside the atmosphere, the characters in this book are just so unforgettable. They're these larger-than-life caricatures in almost like absurd way, but their absurdity doesn't make them any less sympathetic. But really the best part about this book is the setting itself. Gormenghast is so artfully wrought, and I would, without question, easily spend another 1,000 pages exploring its labyrinthine corridors, and it's just so full of life. Every single room in this castle has a story to tell, and Mervyn Peake tells most of them. It's a fantastic fantasy book. And like almost every other book on this list, the reason it works so well, the reason I like this book so much, is because of its prose style. The prose style is fantastic. Right, down to the top 10. Number 10 on my list is Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes. Now, this is a book that I very admittedly struggled with quite a bit. And this isn't to say that this isn't a good, perhaps great book, but I found the reading experience of this to be quite difficult. And a part of this has to do with the fact that I began reading this in mid to late August and finished it in October, i.e. right at the beginning of the fall semester. So I didn't have the brain space or the time really to really dedicate to this book. And this book requires and demands and perhaps rewards very close attention. I mean, as the title suggests, Terra Nostra, our world or our land. This book is about as ambitious as they come. And while the scope of this book is admirable in so many different ways, it is perhaps, I think, too ambitious. Or it just requires like a year of only reading this book. I'm not sure because, again, admittedly, I didn't give it the full attention that it probably deserves. And all this isn't to say that I didn't enjoy this book. The reason it's on this list is because it does some things incredibly well. The first 150 pages or so of this novel are absolutely enchanting. I read it twice. And there are so many just remarkable set pieces that allude to authors like Cervantes and Melville and Shakespeare, and perhaps most importantly, Hieronymus Bosch and his The Garden of Earthly Delight. And these really intertextual scenes are just amazing as they move between the source material in a fluid way, but recreate them in a wholly original way. But that also makes this book incredibly dense. So I'm looking forward to rereading this book sometime in the future when I have a bit more time to give it. I can see why this book is so well regarded, but I can see why others say that this book crumbles under its own ambition. But either way, this absolutely deserves to be in the top 10 of the books that I read this year. All right, I think I'm gonna have to just move all of these. Oh boy. Right, number 9 on my list. Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree and translated by Daisy Rockwell. This book is obviously quite famous now because it won the International Booker, and it really deserved to win the International Booker. In my mind, this book is very much about translation. It's about crossing borders, it's about cultural contact, and it goes through all of these different themes in a rather whimsical way, at least at times. And importantly, this doesn't exclude or neglect or negate the severity of the issues that it is exploring, but it enhances it. At the heart of this book is, I think, a mythologization of the partition of India and the ramifications of that act. But this book reads more like mythology itself at times, as it has all of these digressions and these side plots that we follow. And again, it just strikes that perfect balance for me between being very fun and entertaining and being very, very serious. This is a really good book that if you're interested in translated literature generally, this is one that I think you should really read, as again, I think it's very much about translation at its core. Number 8 on this list is The Catholic School by Edoardo Albinati. And let me just say right now, why yes, I do have a thing for rather long maximalist books. And they are perhaps overrepresented here, but the reason for that is because I honestly just enjoy the experience of reading longer books than I do reading shorter books. I find the faults in longer books to be more permissible as they, again, at least for me, they kind of fade away in the background of what the book is doing well. Again, I might be in the minority here, but I like really long books, and so most of these books are quite long. Anyways, The Catholic School is about as maximalist as it can get, but it's very much about a single night. This night in 1975 where the infamous Churchill rape/murder occurred, where 3 young men kidnapped and tortured 2 young women for like a week and ended up killing one of them. And so that's at the heart of this book. That's what this book is about. But this book, and I think I said this in my review, this book is more an encyclopedia of Rome in the 1970s. It touches on every single part of life in the 1970s. There is a lot of Knausgaardian auto-fiction here that I really like, as Edoardo Albinati did have this very close contact with some of the perpetrators of this crime. He went to school with them. He went to the exact same school that they went to. But this novel really touches on every single aspect of Italian society that led these 3 young men to think that they could do the crime that they did. So it's much more of a sociological novel rather than just a psychological novel. And above all else, it's an interrogation into modern masculinity. And it explores masculinity in a way that isn't just a condemning diatribe, as some people have complained that it is. But I think that it's an incredibly honest and empathetic look into what creates patriarchy and what creates dangerous masculinities and how this affects men just as it affects women, obviously in very different ways. The Catholic School is maximalist to its core, and its prose style, I think, was incredibly smart, but also incredibly gripping. This didn't feel like a 1,200-page novel. I really, really enjoyed this one, and I would strongly recommend it, even though it is, well, it's incredibly long. Number 7 on my list is Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Novels. This was one of my favorite reading experiences of the year. I read the 4 of them back to back to back to back. And so I'm counting the whole series as one, though. I picked the 2nd book to display here because I think that one is my favorite, though the 4th book is pretty good as well. This book follows Elena Greco and her mysterious and alluring friend Lila throughout their lives, from when they meet in childhood at school throughout their young adult and adult lives. It spans pretty much the entire second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. And it's really their friendship with all of its ups and downs that's at the heart of this book. But just like the Catholic school, this book touches on pretty much everything about Italian society in the second half of the 20th century. And in fact, I like to think of this book as a kind of flip side to the Catholic school. I read these sort of, I think, in back-to-back months, but they both touch on so much of the same sociopolitics of the second half of the 20th century. And they do so in very different ways. So it's actually quite nice to compare and contrast these two novels. And I'm sure if there hasn't already, I'm sure someone right now is working on a thesis about auto-fictional Italian novels of the 2010s and is writing a chapter right now comparing these two works. But yeah, Elena Ferrante, very worth reading. The Neapolitan novels, I think, are very, very worth your time. Number 6 on my list is, I think, the most recent read, and that is Stig Dagerman's Island of the Doomed. I absolutely love this book, and I already have written a fairly long review of it. I just haven't gotten around to recording it, but expect that soon. This book is about 7 people who get stranded on a desert island. And so the first half of this book spends a chapter inside the head of each of these characters as they go through one day stranded on this island. And so we're stuck in each of their heads, and they are each inundated with anxiety, trauma, paranoia, guilt, shame. And it's really their thoughts that drive this novel rather than any sort of larger plot. I mean, the fact that they're stranded on a desert island and it doesn't seem like anyone's coming to help them, there isn't much to do. But so we're stuck in each of their heads as they're each longing for human connection, but they're unable to attain it. But the reason I love this book so much is because of the prose. This book has some of the most manic prose I've ever read. It's a wildly written book. The imagery and the metaphors are just insane. And so it has traces of Camus and Sartre and Kafka in its kind of existentialism. But Dagerman's prose is just on another level, more similar to Kafka than the other two. But Dagerman's prose is just perhaps a bit more insane, if possible. This is a fantastic book. I have a lot more to say about it. And again, expect a review in the next few weeks. I've already written a few thousand words on it, so expect that soon. All right, top 5. Number 5 was Ice by Anna Kavan. I also read this one fairly recently, in December, but I just loved this book. It's kind of a sci-fi novel as it takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where a second ice age is coming, or another ice age is coming, perhaps due to the consequences of some sort of nuclear war. We're never quite sure what's happening, but all we know is that all of the ice in the world is slowly coming in and crushing human society. But Kavan writes in such a dreamy and unnerving way that this book, I think, has more in common with like Nabokov's Lolita than it does with a traditional sci-fi novel. The narrator is super unreliable as he seems to have a rather tenuous grip with reality. And so we're never quite sure what's going on. And hell, he's not even quite sure what's going on, it seems. But what he's doing essentially is chasing this young albino girl across this icy landscape. And so it's a bit strange, right? He's obsessed with this young girl. And again, it's never quite clear why, but the reason I like this book so much is because it invites all of these different readings without excluding any of them. If you want to take this book and just read it as an exploration of climate change and climate disasters, you can. If you want to just read it as a book about patriarchy or about gender relations and power, you can. But it's also very much about addiction and obsession and geopolitics. It's about so much. And it's really quite short, but I loved Kavan's prose style, and I loved the story that it told. It was so unnerving and confusing, but in a very good way, I think. Review for that one coming soon as well. Next up on my list is Maidenhair by Mikhail Shishkin. This was one of the first books that I read in 2022, and it has stuck with me the entire year. I absolutely loved this book. And what I really liked about it was how it blended all of these different narrative strands, and more importantly, all these different voices into a single unit, into a single book. Like the titular Maidenhair Fern that gives this book its title, it branches out into hundreds of individual stories and individual voices that echo across time and space, but it all works together as a single unit. And somehow these mythological and legendary stories connect with, mundane stories about asylum seekers seeking asylum in Switzerland, but they all connect. And so this book is structurally quite complex, but it's never confusing or overwhelming, or at least I didn't find it so. Mainly because Shishkin has such control over the narrative, even as at times it threatens to spin out of control. This is a really special book that every single month since I've read it, I've Googled his next book that is due to be translated, The Taking of Ismail, and searched to see if the publisher has given a release date for the translation, and they have not, but know that I will be first in line when they do announce a translation of it. And as I note in my review, Shishkin is super influenced by James Joyce, and so there are all these like Joycean moments throughout. Yeah, it's just a great book. It's one of the, I think, one of the masterpieces of the early 21st century. Number 3 is the Notebook Trilogy by Agatha Christoph. This book is fantastic. It just blew me away when I first read it, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. It's an incredibly disturbing and horrifying book about war and about childhood and memory. And each part of this trilogy really revises the memory that the previous one explored in some really interesting ways. And this book straddles like fable and disturbing war novel in, again, really compelling ways, and in ways that resonate deeply, I think, with both of those kind of genres, fairy tales or fables and war novel. It delves into the depravity that comes with war and how war infiltrates itself into every single aspect of every individual citizen's daily life and their worldview. It's incredibly smart and incredibly moving. Someday I will finish a review of this, but well, for now, let me just say, read this book. Agatha Christoph deserves a much wider readership than she has, as this is simply one of the best books about what war does to wholly ordinary people that I've come across, at least. All right, and on to the top 2. Most of this list, like I said at the beginning, can be kind of shuffled around, a few spots up or down, but the last 2 are pretty much set in stone. My second favorite book from last year is Mircea Cărtărescu's Solenoid. I mean, what a book. This is a book that I started reading, got about 30 pages in, and just thought, there is no way he continues with this for almost 700 pages, but he does. This is a book that, on a sentence level, I don't think many other contemporary authors could achieve. There was rarely a sentence that I found boring, let alone a full scene. This has the right amount of Kafka and Borges and the kind of autofiction that I just adore. It's imaginative, disturbing, unnerving, beautiful, surreal. It plays with surreality quite a bit, and our attempts to escape kind of mundane reality through literature and art and dreams. And yeah, I mean, I don't really have enough positive things to say about this book. I think this is one that really earns the hype and deserves the hype that it's been getting. I can see how some people might find some parts of it tedious, but I mean, I don't know. Again, at the sentence level, I don't know if there's a better writer right now than Cărtărescu. If you're losing hope in the modern contemporary novel, pick up Solenoid, and I think you'll find your hope to be restored. All right, and number 1, my favorite book of last year is, no surprise here, Jan Vos's Septology. Jan Vos is just fantastic. I won't say too much here, as I've already spoken about it probably too much, but yeah, there's no one else like Jan Vos writing today. This is not just a 2022 favorite, but an all-time favorite. I mean, I just got this new copy in. I have another copy in English and a copy in Nynorsk. So yeah, a lot of contemporary literature will fade away as time goes on and we'll forget about it, but I really don't think that'll happen to Septology. And I know this is an obvious thing to say, as it's a de facto truth, but I know a lot of people will not like this book. They will not like the repetitive prose style and the kind of meditative prose style that comes with it, but I just found it to be so utterly enchanting, and again, so unlike anything else that is being written today. It's just such a change of pace from most modern prose styles, and I just appreciate that a lot. I found this experience to be amazing, and I look forward to returning to this book again and again and again. All right, and now for some very quick honorable mentions. Like I said earlier, I'm really bad at making lists, and there's a world in which pretty much any of these books could have made this list if I made this list on another day. But I'm going to run through these quite briefly. First up is George Salas's Sea Above, Sun Below. Absolutely love this book. I think the writing in it is fantastic. It's about like a group of skydivers as they are defying God, falling out of the sky. And so as you can tell just by that, it's very much about, or it very much blends these different mythologies, Abrahamic and Greek for the most part, but super interesting book, and review of that one coming at some point. The next book that I want to mention quickly is Gabriel Blackwell's Doomtown. This is just one of the best short books that I read this year, and it's one of the best books about like grief and trauma and that ever-present sense of doom that permeates every single one of our lives. Absolutely fantastic. I've done a full review of it, so go check that out if you're interested. The next up is a book that I can't for the life of me find right now, The Deloriad by Missouri Williams. Just a crazy book with a crazy prose style that reminds me of Krasznahorkai and McCarthy. I just loved that book. I know a lot of people hated it for various reasons, and that's fine, but I thought it was completely grotesque, but in the best ways. The next one I want to mention is Gerald Murnane's The Plains. This was the first year that I read Murnane. I guess I actually read a few Murnane. I read Border Districts and a few of his short stories in 2021, but I don't really count those because I didn't really like them that much and I didn't really understand them. But I read The Plains and Barley Patch this year. The Plains isn't my favorite book, and I know a lot of Murnane fans say that The Plains isn't his best, though it seems to be the most popular. But the reason why I want to mention him here is because, again, I loved his prose style. I loved his voice, and I think that he can do a lot more interesting things than what he does in The Plains. And I'm really looking forward to this year reading more Murnane. I really want to read Inland, A Million Windows, and A Season on Earth. And next up is Die My Love by Ariana Harwitz. This book was just fantastic. There are some images in this book that still haunt me to this day, and this is one of the most interesting books on the kind of negative sides to motherhood, and I guess parenting in general, but specifically motherhood, that I've read. This book is horrifying and disturbing, and again, the prose style, I know I just keep saying it, is so compelling. She writes in these like very short, very staccato sentences that are each bursting with energy and bursting with just visceral metaphors and imagery that, yeah, they stay with me. Absolutely loved it. Next one I want to mention very quickly, Edouard Louvet's Suicide. Yeah, I mean, I've done a full review of it. One of the most interesting and compelling and horrifying books about suicide that I've read. I really want to read more by him. I also want to mention two more. America and the Cult of the Cactus Boots, a Diagnostic by Philip Friedenberg. This book was just so much fun. I read this. This was one of the first books that I read in 2022. Very much about how art and creativity open up these new dimensions for interpersonal relationships and for connection. Really smart book, really fun book that I really, really liked. And then I just lied, two more books. One that, again, I have no idea where I put it. I can't find it, but I want to mention B.R. Yeager's Amygdalatropolis. Perhaps subconsciously I hid it on myself because that book is disgusting and terrifying, but also one of the best books about the internet age and how the internet has like physically in a lot of ways like reshaped our brains. Fascinating, disturbing, disgusting, amazing book. And the last one I want to mention, for real this time, is Oakley Hall's Warlock, which is just an incredible Western that is very much about American mythology and very much about how we draw so much of our national ethos and our national character from our perception of the Wild West. And Hall goes through these mythologies, this American mythology, and works to kind of slowly deconstruct them while also just writing a very fun gunslinging Western that is a joy to read, but also very, very smart. It's been praised by authors and people like Thomas Pynchon. It's very worth reading if you haven't read it yet. All right, I'll stop there. I could probably keep going, as I know as soon as I stop recording that there'll be another book that I know deserves another mention, but alas. If any of these books interested you, please do check out my full reviews. I have full reviews of most of them, and then some of them I mentioned in like monthly wrap-ups or whatever. But let me know what you think of any of these books or all of these books, and let me know what some of your favorite books of 2022 was. I'd be interested to know. But for now, here's to another wonderful reading year. Thanks for watching.